The morning August Bailey started singing again was the same morning Hazel Thatcher decided she could no longer run from the life she had built herself, brick by stubborn brick, in the dust and heat of Caldwell, Kansas, in the year of our Lord 1882. Hazel had arrived in Caldwell 6 months prior on a rattling stagecoach that smelled of horse sweat and old leather, carrying 2 carpet bags, a tin of her mother's shortbread recipes, and a grief she had not yet learned to name. She was 26 years old, broad-shouldered for a woman, with amber-green eyes that seemed to shift color depending on the light, and hair the color of dark chestnuts that she kept pinned up and practical. She had come west from Ohio after her father's general store had been taken by debt, and her mother had gone to live with her older sister in Cincinnati, and the man she had been quietly seeing for 3 years had chosen quietly and without ceremony to marry someone else instead. Hazel had stood in the middle of her emptied childhood bedroom and made a decision. She would not wait for the world to hand her something worth keeping. She would go find it herself. She had answered an advertisement in the Cleveland Plain Dealer seeking a schoolteacher for the frontier town of Caldwell, Kansas, a cattle boomtown sitting right on the edge of Indian Territory, where the Kishom Trail cut through like a wound in the earth. The advertisement had promised a modest salary, a small dwelling adjacent to the schoolhouse, and what it called opportunity for a capable woman of education. Hazel had folded the paper into her apron pocket, written back that same afternoon, and within 3 weeks received a letter from a Reverend Hollis Crane, who served on the town's school committee, informing her that the position was hers if she could arrive before September. She had made it with 4 days to spare. Caldwell in 1882 was not a gentle town. It sat at the southern edge of Kansas, a crossing point for trail herds moving north from Texas, and so it drew the rougher breed of men, cowboys who came up from the long drives with wages burning holes in their pockets and months of hard living behind their eyes. There were 2 hotels, 3 saloons, a bank, a livery stable, a barber, a land office, a small infirmary run by a half-deaf physician named Dr. Emmett Foote, and the church where Reverend Crane delivered his sermons with equal parts fire and mercy. And there was the schoolhouse on Pine Street, a low wooden building with a patched roof and a small iron bell, where Hazel Thatcher took up her post in September and met the 14 children, who would become the reason she stayed through the first brutal winter. She met August Bailey on her 4th day in town. He came into the general store owned by a man named Willard Potts while Hazel was purchasing chalk and a replacement globe that had lost half of South America to some previous student's enthusiasm. August was tall, perhaps an inch or 2 over 6 feet, with broad shoulders that had been hammered wide by years of working cattle and working land. He wore his dark brown hair a little long, curling at the collar of a faded blue work shirt, and he had a jaw that looked as though it had been set against hard weather and harder years. He was 31 years old. His eyes were the color of a sky just before rain, a deep gray blue that held something in them she could not immediately identify but would later come to understand was the particular quietness of a man who has stopped expecting things to go well. He bought a sack of flour, a tin of coffee, and a coil of rope. He said 6 words total, 4 to Willard Potts about credit and 2 to Hazel when she stepped aside to let him pass, which were simply, "Much obliged, ma'am." He did not smile. He paid and left. Willard Potts watched him go and shook his head with what seemed like practiced sympathy. "That's August Bailey," he said, though Hazel had not asked. "Owns the Double B Ranch out north of town. Good man, decent sort. Lost his wife, Clara, about 2 years back now. Fever took her in February, terrible thing. They had a little boy too, Eli. He raises that child alone now." Willard appeared to feel he had said something meaningful, and he returned to his accounting without another word. Hazel filed the information away in the careful way she filed all information and went back to her schoolhouse. She saw August Bailey in town once or twice each week over those first months, and their interactions remained brief and polite and impersonal. He would nod. She would nod. He bought his supplies. She purchased hers. On one occasion in late October, he held open the door of the post office for her while she wrestled with a parcel from her mother containing a winter coat and 3 jars of blackberry preserves, and she thanked him, and he said, "Yes, ma'am," and walked on. She found herself mildly irritated by the efficiency with which he kept her at arm's length, not because she had any particular interest in being invited closer, but because she was a curious woman by nature, and people who refused to be known presented an unconscious challenge. What she learned about him, she learned from other people. From Mabel Crane, the Reverend's wife, who brought Hazel soup when the weather turned cold and talked while she arranged the soup and the crackers and the dried herbs. From Owen Garrett, the deputy sheriff, who was talkative in the way of men who are lonely but accustomed to it. From Eli, August's son, who was 6 years old and appeared in Hazel's schoolroom on the first Monday in October with his hair recently and poorly combed, and a tin lunch pail that his father had filled with hardtack and an apple, and who sat in the 3rd row with the focused intensity of a child doing his very best to get something right. Eli Bailey was a quiet, serious little boy with his father's gray-blue eyes and his mother's, by all reported accounts, gentleness. He applied himself to his letters with concentration, and when he made progress, he did not celebrate loudly, but simply looked satisfied in a private, interior way that reminded Hazel so strongly of August that she caught herself smiling at the similarity. He rarely spoke about his mother, but once in November, when the other children were drawing pictures of their families and Eli sat with his pencil still, Hazel had come to sit beside him and asked gently what he was thinking. He had said, with the plainness of a child who has no artifice, "My mother is in heaven. I don't know what she looks like anymore because I was only 4. Hazel had felt something move through her chest like a current. She had asked Eli to describe to her what he remembered, and she had helped him draw what she gathered from his fragmented words, a woman with light hair and a smile that he said went all the way up. And when Eli looked at the drawing he had said, "That's her," with a certainty that made Hazel want to weep and refuse to, for his sake. That afternoon she had walked past the Double B on her way back from visiting the Crane family, and had seen August in the yard, splitting firewood in the early dark of November's late afternoon. He swung the axe with the mechanical rhythm of a man performing a necessary task, nothing more. There was no music in it. She had thought, strangely, that it seemed wrong, that a man who had once had a wife and now had only the work should at least have some music in the work. She did not stop to think about why the thought occurred to her. December brought with it a blizzard that shut Caldwell down for 4 days and left drifts chest-high against the buildings on Main Street, and when the world opened up again, it was with the particular brittle beauty of a plains winter, the sky gone so blue and clear it looked painted, the snow catching every angle of light. The children came back to school red-cheeked and alive with the energy of enforced indoor days, and Hazel set them to reading and arithmetic with a firmness that was also affection, which was the only kind of firmness she knew how to do. On the 2nd day after the blizzard, August Bailey came to the schoolhouse. This was unusual. Parents came to the schoolhouse for particular occasions, the monthly recitation evenings, or when they needed to speak with Hazel about a child's progress, but not simply on an afternoon in December. He knocked at the door, and when she opened it, he was standing in the cold with his hat in his hands, which she noticed immediately as a sign of what the visit cost him in effort of courtesy. "Miss Thatcher," he said, "I wanted to thank you." She waited. Eli showed me the drawing. He stopped. He looked at some middle distance past her shoulder. "The one you helped him make, of his mother." "It was his memory," she said. "I only held the pencil with him." August looked at her then, directly, for the first time she could remember. His gray-blue eyes held something raw and honest in them that he appeared to be working to manage. "He keeps it under his pillow," he said. "He sleeps better." The sentence cost him something. She could see it. "I'm glad," she said, and meant it simply, without drama. He nodded. He put his hat back on. He turned to go and then turned back with a quality of decision as though he had prepared a second thing to say and was now delivering it. "You are doing a fine thing for these children, ma'am. Caldwell didn't always have a teacher worth a damn. Pardon the language." "Pardon granted," she said. "And thank you, Mr. Bailey." He left. But she stood at the door a moment after the sound of his horse faded, and she was aware that something in the architecture of her days had shifted, very slightly, the way a room shifts when a window is opened and air that was still begins to move. January was the month that trouble came to Caldwell in the form of a man named Harlan Webb, which was a name that people in 3 counties said with a sideways look. Webb was a cattle broker and land speculator who had been circling the southern Kansas territory for 2 years, buying up land at below-value prices from men who were struggling, using methods that ranged from aggressive negotiation to outright intimidation to, on 2 occasions that people talked about quietly, arrangements with certain men of rough character who made things inconvenient for those who refused to sell. He arrived in Caldwell in mid-January with 2 associates and a portfolio of papers and a smile that was wide and did not extend past his mouth. Webb had his eye on several parcels of land along the creek north of town, and one of those parcels happened to include the southern portion of the Double B Range, where August Bailey's cattle grazed through the winter on the dormant grass that still held enough nutrient in the roots to keep a herd through till spring. August had been offered 30 cents on the dollar for the land 3 years ago and had refused. Webb appeared to regard refusals as the opening position in a negotiation that had not yet started. Hazel became aware of this because Caldwell was not a large town, and its troubles moved through it, the way sound moves through a small room. She heard the details from Owen Garrett, the deputy, and from Mabel Crane, and she felt the particular discomfort of hearing that someone she had come to regard, if not precisely warmly then at least with respect and a growing attention, was being squeezed by a man whose wealth was built on other people's losses. She saw August in Potts's store in mid-January, and he was speaking in a low, controlled voice to Willard Potts about whether the bank had received any communications from a Webb Associates company, and Willard was shaking his head, and August's jaw was set with a tightness that spoke of managed anger. When he saw Hazel, he paused, and then he nodded and she nodded back, and neither of them pretended the conversation she had half overheard had not occurred. "Mr. Bailey," she said, when Willard went to the back for her flour, "I hope things are settling." He looked at her with a directness she was coming to recognize as simply how he was when he chose to engage at all. "They're not settled yet," he said, "but they will be." "I believe you," she said, and was surprised to find she did. Something crossed his face that was not quite a smile but was in the neighborhood of one. "You've got a bold way of saying things, Miss Thatcher." "I'm from Ohio," she said. "We come out plain." That time he did smile briefly, and it transformed his face in a way that was startling in its warmth, like a sudden clearing in weather. He caught it, the smile, and looked away as though he was not certain he had the right to it, but it had happened. She had seen it. In February, the Webb situation came to its first real confrontation. 2 of Webb's associates rode out to the Double B on a Tuesday morning, when August was mending fence line in the far pasture with his ranch hand. A young Mexican man named Pedro Vasquez, who had been with August for 3 years, and had the loyalty of someone who has been treated fairly in a world that often failed to provide that. The 2 men spoke to August about the land offer, which had by this point increased slightly in Webb's calculation of what it might take, and when August told them the land was not for sale at any price they would name, one of the men knocked over a water barrel near the fence post and said something Pedro Vasquez later described as threatening in its pleasantness, which was a phrase Hazel thought captured something precise about the nature of certain kinds of menace. August did not rise to it. He waited until the men had ridden away, and then he rode directly into town and spoke with Owen Garrett and then with the land office, and then, with a methodical calm that Hazel would later understand was one of his core qualities, He went to the telegraph office and sent a wire to the county seat requesting a review of all transactions Webb had completed in the county. He did not rage. He did not threaten back. He built a case the way a man builds a fence, one post at a time, driven deep. Hazel learned of this sequence of events from Owen Garrett, who told it with admiration. She was sitting in the small infirmary beside the bed of one of her students, young Thomas Pierce, who had taken a bad chest cold that had kept him out of school for 2 weeks and who benefited, she felt, from being read to. When Owen came in for his weekly consultation with Dr. Foote about his bad knee, he found Hazel there and sat for a while and talked, as Owen did, and told her about August Bailey and how he had handled the thing with Webb's men. "He's a steady man," Owen said. "Doesn't crack easy. He used to be more of a talker, I think, before Clara died. Used to sing at the church social. Beautiful voice, actually. Funny, isn't it, how a man can just stop doing certain things?" He shook his head with the mild mournfulness of a man observing something from a safe distance. Hazel looked at Thomas, who had fallen asleep during the telling, and she thought about a man who had once sung at church socials and now did not sing anywhere at all. And she thought about a 6-year-old boy sleeping with a drawing of his mother under his pillow. And she thought about what it meant to carry a loss and choose to keep walking through it every day without letting it become the only thing you were. She did not examine too closely why she kept thinking about August Bailey. March arrived, and with it, a softening of the air that was not yet warmth but was the promise of it, and the mud season that every Plains town suffered through with collective stoic endurance. The school had a spring recitation planned for the first week of April, and Hazel threw herself into preparing her students with the focused energy of a woman who finds purpose a useful thing to hold on to. Eli Bailey was learning to read with an intensity that his father seemed to regard as both gratifying and slightly overwhelming. August came for the monthly recitation in February and sat in the back row on a wooden chair that was somewhat too small for him, and he listened to Eli read a passage from a primer with his large hands rested on his knees and his expression containing something careful and unguarded. When Eli finished and looked up and found his father in the room, the boy's face opened like a door, and August had nodded once, which was enough. After the recitation, while the other parents gathered in small groups and the children ran in the yard despite the cold, August had come to Hazel and said, without preamble, "He's getting real good. He works hard," she said. "He has discipline beyond his years." "He comes by that honest," August said, and there was a quality in his voice that told her he meant Clara, not himself, and she respected that he said it. "I imagine it comes from both sides," she said quietly. He looked at her with that direct gray-blue gaze, and she held it and did not look away, and the moment was longer than it needed to be by any practical measure. He was the one who looked away first, but not from discomfort. It seemed rather like a man making a deliberate choice to pace himself. "Good evening, Miss Thatcher," he said. "Good evening, Mr. Bailey." She watched him find Eli in the yard and lift him onto his shoulders, the boy laughing, and ride him back toward where the horses were hitched, and she stood in the cold with her arms folded and felt something she recognized but was not quite ready to name. April came with wild grass and the first cattle drives beginning their push north, and Caldwell woke from its winter stillness into the noise and commerce of a trail town. The streets filled with drovers and their dust, and the saloons ran long nights, and Hazel made sure the schoolhouse windows were closed in the early mornings when the language from the street ran toward the colorful. The Webb situation found its resolution in the second week of April, which felt like a gift the season had been building toward. The county investigation, prompted by August's wire and supported by depositions from 2 other ranchers who had been similarly pressed, found sufficient evidence of fraudulent assessment practices in Webb's land dealings to revoke 2 of his recent transactions and issue a formal censure. Webb left Caldwell on a Thursday afternoon without ceremony, and those who watched him go said he left looking like a man who was recalculating his geography. August was at the land office when the news was confirmed, and then he was at the bank, and then, in the early evening, he rode out of town toward the Double B, and Hazel saw him from her window as he passed, sitting straight in the saddle, and she thought he looked like a man who had put something down that he had been carrying for a long time. She went to see him the next day. She had a reason. Pedro Vasquez's younger brother, Diego, who had come up from Texas and was newly arrived in Caldwell, had expressed interest in learning to read, and she had heard that Pedro had connections at the Double B, and she thought perhaps August would be willing to pass the word. It was a real reason, and also not the only reason. She had learned, in her 26 years, that most things worth doing contained more than one truth at once. She rode out to the Double B on a Friday morning, on a borrowed sorrel mare that had a philosophical temperament suited to dirt roads, and found the ranch in that specific kind of productive disorder that marks a working place. There were horses in the corral, 3 dogs who announced her arrival with varying levels of commitment, and Pedro Vasquez repairing a wagon wheel near the barn who waved and pointed her toward the house when she asked for August. August came out of the house wiping his hands on a cloth, and when he saw her there was a clear moment of surprise, followed by something else, something less guarded than his usual. He was in his work clothes without his hat, and his dark hair was slightly disordered, and he looked, she thought, more like a man and less like a figure. "Miss Thatcher," he said, "is something wrong with Eli?" "Eli is perfectly well," she said, dismounting. "I came to ask you something if you have a moment." He had a moment. He was also, she noticed, making an effort to appear less pleased by her presence than he might actually have been, which was its own kind of telling. She explained about Diego Vasquez and the reading lessons, and August listened and said he would speak to Pedro and that yes, if the young man wanted to come to town for lessons that was a fine thing and the Double B could spare Pedro's brother on Saturday mornings. "Good," she said. "Thank you." There was a pause. A warm April wind moved through the yard, bending the new grass. "You're welcome to sit," he said, gesturing at a pair of weathered chairs on the narrow porch. "I was about to get coffee." She sat. He brought coffee in 2 tin cups that were clean and had clearly been considered before being used, and he sat across from her, and they drank their coffee in the morning and talked. Really talked, not the brief exchanges of a small town with limited time and mutual caution, but talked the way people do when something in them has decided the other person is worth the effort. She told him about Ohio and her father's store and the reason she had come west, plainly and without self-pity. He listened with the quality of a man who does not hear things halfway. He told her, in return, about the Double B, how he had built it with his own hands on land he had bought cheap, because it was considered too far from water, and how he had spent 2 years digging and routing water to prove everyone wrong. He told her about the winter calving and the trail market and what the cattle business had been 4 years ago before the ranges started crowding. He did not mention Clara, but she was there in the space between his words the way a note that has stopped playing still rings in a room. "You built something real here," Hazel said, looking out at the pasture where the cattle moved in their slow, deliberate way. "I'm trying," he said. "It's enough to keep a man honest." She looked at him and he was looking at the pasture, and then he looked at her, and the morning sun was full and warm, and the sky was the clean blue of a day that has not yet been used. "Mr. Bailey," she said, "why do you work so hard at being difficult to know?" The question surprised him. She could see it. He was a man who was rarely surprised and enjoyed it even less than most. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "I'm not trying to be difficult," he said after a moment. "You're not trying not to be," she said. He was quiet for a long time, long enough that she wondered if she had gone too far and trespassed on something that was not hers. Then he said, "It's easier to keep to the work." "Easier than what?" she asked softly. He looked at her directly then, fully, with those rain-colored eyes, and she felt the weight of the look, the way it held more than words could carry. "Than caring about things that might leave," he said. He said it without bitterness but also without pretense, and it was one of the most honest things anyone had said to her in a very long time. She did not flinch from it. I understand that, she said. I came out here for the same reason, in a way. If you're the one who leaves first, it's less painful. He considered that. Except you build a school and teach 14 children to read, he said. That doesn't look much like someone not caring. No, she agreed. It doesn't work as well as you think it will. He almost smiled again. She was beginning to collect his almost smiles the way some people collect stones, not to show anyone, just to hold. She left before noon, riding back on the sorrel with the warm wind at her back, and she allowed herself the honest thought she had been circling for months. She liked August Bailey. She liked the way he was made, the steadiness and the quiet and the held-back warmth that you could sense the way you sense warmth through a closed door. She liked his grief, which was an odd thing to say but was true, because it was grief that had been earned and honored and not performed. She liked his son, who was his father in miniature but had inherited some light from his mother that kept the whole picture from being too serious. She liked him, and it frightened her in the useful way that important things have of being frightening. In May, the spring recitation brought all of Caldwell's parents into the schoolhouse on a Friday evening. The room smelled of sawdust and chalk and the wildflowers that two of the girls had arranged on the teacher's desk. The children stood in a row and recited passages from their readers, and from the Constitution, and from a poem by Longfellow that Hazel had selected, because it was about endurance, and the sea and she found both subjects applicable to Kansas. Eli Bailey stood third from the left, and when his turn came, he read a passage from the primer with clear, measured confidence, each word placed like something valuable, and he looked up when he was done and found his father in the room. And August's face held something that people in that room remembered for a long time afterward, the expression of a man who has been given something he did not expect to be given again, uncomplicated joy. After the recitation, August sought Hazel out in the small crowd. He was carrying his hat. She noticed he did this when he was making an effort at something vulnerable. "That boy," he said, and stopped. "I know," she said. "He read better than half the adults in this county." "He read very well," she agreed. "He has a gift for it." August looked at her with that full, direct look. "I owe you a debt, Miss Thatcher." "You don't owe me anything," she said. "He did the work. You made him love the work." He said it simply, with the authority of a man who has watched something happen from the beginning and knows what caused it. There was music playing somewhere outside. Someone had brought a fiddle to the gathering, and through the open door the sweet, slightly wandering notes of a Virginia reel drifted in on the evening air. Some of the children were already moving toward it. Eli grabbed a girl named Rosie Pierce, Thomas's sister, and dragged her out the door laughing. "Do you dance, Mr. Bailey?" Hazel asked. "I used to," he said. "Haven't in some time." "Would you like to?" she asked. She had not planned the question. It came out of her the way certain true things do, without permission. He looked at her, caught by the directness of it, and she looked back at him, and the fiddle was playing, and the evening was warm and gold-lit, and something between them was making a decision regardless of whether either of them was ready for it. "Yes," he said, "I would." They danced on the packed earth outside the schoolhouse with a dozen other couples and twice that many watching children. And he was not a graceful dancer, but he was a steady one. And she fit against his lead with a naturalness that she filed away to examine later, in the privacy of her own thoughts. He held her with a careful propriety, and also with a firmness that suggested he was aware of every inch of the distance between them. When the song ended, they stood slightly apart and both were slightly flushed, and the evening was moving into its deep blue, and she said, "Thank you." "Thank you," he said. That was all. But she rode home on the sorrel with something singing in her chest that she was no longer trying to pretend was just the fiddle music. June came in with heat and long days, and the constant flow of cattle through Caldwell that marked the peak of the trail season. Hazel kept the school open for the month to accommodate families who could not afford to have children idle, and taught summer reading and arithmetic in the mornings, and spent her afternoons visiting the families on the outskirts of town, some of whom lived in circumstances that troubled her deeply. There were families from freed communities, black men and women who had come west after the war with the same hope that brought everyone to the frontier, and had found that the West, for all its advertised freedom, carried many of the East's cruelties in new arrangements. Hazel was not naive about this. She included every child in her classroom who wanted to be there, and she had 2 quiet but firm conversations with certain parents about what her schoolroom was and was not, and she won both conversations, and she did not regret the effort. August came to town on Tuesdays and Fridays. She began to find that she organized her town errands around these days without making a conscious decision to do so. When they met, their conversations had grown longer, wider, more honest. He had begun to tell her things about the ranch, about Eli, about small practical matters of his days, and she had begun to feel that she was being trusted with the interior of a life, not shown the outside of one. In the middle of June, he came to find her with a purpose she recognized immediately because he was carrying his hat again and had the look of a man rehearsed. "I'd like to take you to supper," he said, "at the hotel, on Saturday if you're not engaged." She looked at him for just a moment, feeling that singing again in her chest, and said, "I'm not engaged." "Good," he said. He seemed very slightly relieved, which she found wonderful. "Good. Saturday, then." The hotel dining room was not elegant, but someone had made an effort with tablecloths, and the lamps were lit, and the food was hearty and good. And August sat across from her, with the clean-scrubbed quality of a man who had given the occasion proper consideration, and she felt a tenderness toward him that she could no longer pretend was impersonal. They talked for 3 hours. They talked about books, because she had discovered he read more than the average man in a cattle town, from a small library he kept on a shelf above the fireplace. He had a copy of Moby Dick that had been read to pieces and held together with a strip of leather. He had a volume of Emerson. He had a battered edition of the complete works of Shakespeare that he said he had purchased at auction in Wichita 5 years ago because Clara had always wanted to read them, and he had never gotten around to buying them for her while she lived, and he had felt that buying them now was a way of honoring the intention. This was the first time he had mentioned Clara's name to Hazel directly. She received it with the care it deserved. "Do you read them?" she asked. "Some," he said. "More than I expected to like. Though I'll tell you honestly, the tragedies don't hold much appeal for me anymore." "No," she said. "I can understand that." He looked at his hands, which were large and calloused, wrapped around a coffee cup. "She was sick for 2 months," he said. "River fever. Doc Foote did what he could. She was 29 years old. He said it without the carefully measured blankness of a man who has learned to say it without feeling. He said it with the quiet exactness of a man for whom the number still holds its full weight. Eli was 4. He asks me sometimes why God needed her more than us." He paused. "I don't have a good answer for that." "I'm not sure there is one," Hazel said. "No," he said. "I think you're right." The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that has substance to it, that acknowledges something real. "I'm glad you told me," she said. He looked up at her. "I'm glad I did too," he said, and it sounded like a discovery. On the walk back to her dwelling beside the schoolhouse, the summer night full of crickets and stars and the distant sounds of the saloon district, he walked beside her and his arm brushed hers, and neither of them moved away from the contact. At her door he stopped and turned to face her, and she turned to face him, and they were close enough that she could see the particular quality of his attention, entirely on her, nothing held back for caution. "Miss Thatcher," he said. "Hazel." "Yes," she said. "I'd like to take you to supper again." She smiled. "I'd like that," she said. "August." The first time she used his name his eyes went a shade darker, or perhaps she imagined it, but she did not think she had imagined it. He nodded. He said good night. He walked back toward where his horse was hitched with a steadiness that she found extremely attractive in a way she was done analyzing. She went inside and stood in the middle of her small room, and pressed her hands against her face and laughed quietly into them, which was an entirely new feeling in that body of hers that had carried so much careful practicality for so long. July burned bright and hot, and Hazel Thatcher was, by any honest accounting, falling in love. She fell with the attentiveness of a woman who has been self-sufficient long enough to notice exactly what is happening to her and find it interesting rather than frightening. She noticed the way she thought about August at odd moments, washing dishes, correcting slates, watching the wide Kansas sky for weather. She noticed the way his opinion had become something she considered, the way a thought in your own mind is considered, as part of the process rather than external to it. They saw each other regularly now. Supper at the hotel had become a bi-weekly event. He brought Eli on Sundays when the church social gathered on the Crane's lawn, and Hazel was always there, and Eli would find her immediately and tell her about whatever he had been reading during the week with a running commentary that August listened to with visible amusement. August and Hazel talked around and through and alongside Eli's enthusiasms, and there was a shape to the three of them together that felt, she thought, so natural it almost alarmed her. "He thinks the world of you," August said one Sunday, watching Eli demonstrate a somersault for the benefit of Rosie Pierce, who was unimpressed but polite. "More than the world. The feeling is entirely mutual," she said. He looked at her. "I know," he said, "and that matters to me more than you know." It was a declaration of something she felt, not of everything but of a significant something. She held it. In the second week of July, a thing happened that she would tell the story of for the rest of her life. She had ridden out to the Double B to return a book August had lent her, a volume of landscape essays about the American Southwest that she had found both beautiful and scientifically questionable. And she had arrived earlier than expected because the horse was in good spirits and the road was dry. The ranch was quiet in the way of early mornings, Pedro Vasquez not yet visible, Eli presumably still asleep. She had tied the mare at the post and walked toward the house to knock when she heard it. A voice, August's voice, coming from around the side of the house where she knew, from a previous visit, there was a small kitchen garden that Clara had started and that August had kept going, planting what he remembered she had planted, tomatoes and beans and a row of marigolds that Eli called Mama's flowers. She stopped walking. The voice was singing. It was a low sound, quiet and unhurried, the kind of singing a man does when he thinks no one is near, when he is simply giving voice to something inside him without intention or performance. The song was an old hymn, one she knew from Ohio, "Be Thou My Vision," and he sang it in a baritone that was rough-edged and warm like firelight through a window, not trained but true, carrying the melody with a certainty that told her this was not a man who had forgotten how to sing. This was a man who had, for some time, simply not had a reason. She stood on the far side of the corner of the house in the early July morning and she did not move, because to move would be to interrupt something she felt, with absolute certainty, was important. She did not know all that it meant in that moment. She understood some of it. She understood enough. The song continued for another 2 verses and then stopped, not with drama but with the natural quiet of something concluded. She waited a breath. Then she walked around the corner and he was there, crouched over the tomato plants with a small hand spade, and he looked up at the sound of her footfall, and the expression on his face shifted through several things in quick sequence. Surprise, the particular flare of exposure that a man feels when he has been in an unguarded moment, and then something else, something that held still. "Miss Thatcher," he said, standing. "Hazel," she corrected, and her voice was level but something in her eyes was not, and he could see it. "Hazel," he said. He brushed the dirt from his hands. "You're here early." "The road was good," she said. She held up the book. "I wanted to return this." He took it. His fingers brushed hers in the taking, and neither of them observed the propriety of not noticing. "Did you hear me?" he said. It was not precisely a question. "I did," she said. He looked at the garden, at the marigolds that were Mama's flowers. "I used to sing a lot," he said. "Before." He said the word simply, without elaboration, because before was understood between them now. "I know," she said. "Owen told me." He nodded slowly. "I stopped after." He turned the book in his hands. "I didn't plan to. It just didn't happen anymore." She waited. This morning I was out here and the light was coming up and the tomatoes are doing well and Eli was asleep in the house and he stopped. He looked at her with the full weight of his gray-blue gaze. It came back. The morning was all around them, warm and still and impossibly large in the way of Kansas mornings, and the marigolds were orange and yellow against the dark soil, and the sky was beginning its daily translation from pale gold to full blue. She stepped forward, closing the space between them that had always been careful and maintained with mutual understanding, and she put her hand against his jaw, her palm against his rough cheek, and he went entirely still, like a man who has been waiting so long for something that its arrival is almost difficult to receive. "August," she said. "Hazel," he said, and his voice was lower than usual and held something that had no other name but her name. He put his hand over hers, the large calloused hand holding her hand against his face, and he closed his eyes for a moment. And when he opened them they were very close and the morning was very bright, and she knew, with the absolute clarity of a woman who has learned the difference between what she wants and what she is afraid to want, that she was in love with this man. Fully. Without condition. "I should ask you something," he said, "properly." "Ask it," she said. "Not here," he said. "Not yet, not until I've said it right." She took her hand from his face slowly, and he let it go slowly, and she smiled at him with everything she was feeling, and he looked at her with those eyes that held nothing back in that moment, nothing at all. "I'll wait," she said. He nodded. He looked like a man who had been given both a gift and a responsibility, and who was glad of both. She rode back to town on the sorrel with the morning wide around her, and something in her chest that was not merely singing, but was a full, sustained chord, the kind that rings and does not stop. The days that followed had the quality of something approaching its fullness. August came to town with a purposefulness in his manner that people noticed without entirely understanding, and Hazel taught her students with a happiness that several of the children reported to their parents, who reported it to each other, and Caldwell being what it was, this information traveled efficiently through its social channels. Mabel Crane came to the schoolhouse with pie one afternoon, which was the social equivalent of a formal announcement of intention, and sat with Hazel and talked about nothing in particular for the first half hour, and then said, with the brisk warmth of a woman who believes in people getting on with things, "August Bailey is a good man, Hazel. He has been walking around this town for 2 years like a man who has misplaced the better part of himself. I do not think it has been misplaced so much as it has been waiting. She ate a piece of pie. That is all I will say about it." "That's quite enough," Hazel said, hiding her smile in her own piece of pie. "Good," said Mabel. On a Saturday in late July, August came to town and came to the schoolhouse in the early morning. Hazel was there preparing for the week, arranging new slates and setting out the readers, and when she heard the knock she opened the door and he was standing on the step in his best clothes, which on August Bailey meant a dark jacket over a clean white shirt and dark trousers and boots that had been polished to a point that spoke of serious effort. He was holding his hat and something else. He was holding a small bunch of wildflowers, the kind that grew along the creek in summer, blue and yellow and white, nothing formal, nothing purchased, simply gathered with intention. "August," she said. "Hazel," he said. "Good morning." "Good morning," she said, and stepped aside to let him in because the street had ears and the ears had Mabel Crane attached to them. He stepped inside. He stood in the schoolroom, which smelled of chalk and wood and the particular scent of children that never fully left a schoolroom, and he looked at her with everything arranged and present in his face, no walls, no management, no careful distance. He held out the flowers. She took them. "I have been trying," he said, "to find the words for this since February." "February," she said softly. That was the night of the recitation. The night he had smiled at her and looked away as if unsure he was allowed. "I love you," he said. He said it with the directness of a man who has had a long acquaintance with loss, and therefore understands that precision about important things is not coldness but care. I did not expect to say those words again to anyone. I did not think I had the right to, or the courage, or he paused, choosing the heart for it. But you have been steadily, and I think maybe not entirely accidentally, proving me wrong about that. She felt her throat tighten in the way it did when something was real enough to be almost painful. August, she said, I want to ask you to marry me, he said. I want to ask you to marry me and come to the double B and be Eli's. He stopped. His voice had done something. He steadied it. Be Eli's mother if that is something you could want, and be my wife if I have anything worth offering you. I know the ranch is plain and the life is hard, and I am— He looked at her with a humility that was more becoming on him than any pride could have been. I am not easy. No, she said. You are not easy. Neither am I. Something shifted in his face, a hope clarifying. But, she said, I came west to find something worth keeping, and I have been keeping you in mind, August Bailey, for the better part of 6 months, and I believe with considerable confidence that you are that thing. He exhaled, a long, real breath. Is that a yes? Yes, she said, it is. He stepped forward and took her free hand, the one not holding the wildflowers, and held it with both of his, and looked at her with those gray-blue eyes that held her and the room and the morning all at once, and said very quietly, Thank you. She laughed because it was such an August Bailey thing to say. You're thanking me for saying I'll marry you. I am, he said. Yes, she shook her head. August. Hazel, you are entirely something, she said. I believe that's a compliment, he said, and smiled, the full smile this time, not caught and not managed. And it was, as she had known from the first glimpse of it, extraordinary. He held her hand, and she held her wildflowers, and the schoolroom was golden with morning light, and she felt the rightness of it settle into her like roots. The wedding was held in September, a full year after Hazel had arrived in Caldwell. Reverend Crane performed the ceremony in the church on a morning that was bright and cool with the first hint of autumn in the air, and the whole town came, or near enough that the distinctions did not matter. Mabel Crane cried. Owen Garrett stood very straight and looked pleased. Pedro Vasquez and his brother Diego sat in the third row, and Diego had a reader tucked in his jacket pocket, which Hazel noticed and loved. Eli Bailey stood at his father's side as the boy equivalent of a best man, wearing a new suit that August had ordered specially from Wichita, and that Eli had expressed his admiration for in a speech to Hazel the previous day that contained the phrases, very fine indeed, and worthy of the occasion, which were phrases Hazel recognized as belonging to a book she had lent him, and that she found herself hoping he would keep using. She wore a dress of deep blue-green, the color of her eyes on certain days, that she and Mabel had worked on together through 3 fittings, and she walked herself down the aisle because she was a woman who had come to this day under her own power and wanted to arrive the same way. She carried the wildflowers, or as close to them as the season allowed, the ones August had brought her in July, now pressed between the pages of her Ohio primer. And she carried instead a small spray of late summer asters, white and gold against the blue of her dress. When she reached August at the altar, he looked at her the way he had looked at her in the schoolroom that morning in July, with all of himself fully present, and she looked back the same way, and Reverend Crane had to clear his throat once before either of them remembered there were words to be said. The words were said. When it came to the part where August took her hand and his voice carried the vow in that baritone she had heard singing in the garden, and when he said, I will, it rang through the small church the way a bell does, with a quality of completion. She thought she might not survive the volume of feeling in her chest. Then Reverend Crane said, You may kiss your bride, and August cupped her face in both his large hands with a gentleness that was all the more affecting for the roughness of those hands, and kissed her softly and properly, and she kissed him back, and Eli tugged August's coat afterward and said, Is that it? With the critical air of a boy who had expected more drama, and everyone laughed, and the church smelled of candles and autumn, and this, Hazel thought, was the sound of a life beginning. The autumn months settled over the double B with a golden peace that Hazel drank in the way She drank her first cup of coffee in the morning, not greedily, but with full attention. The house was small but well built, August having constructed it with the same careful precision he applied to everything, and she learned its rhythms the way she learned a new book, finding where the light was best in the mornings, which boards in the floor were particular about being stepped on quietly, where the draft came in the winter and how to manage it. She and Eli established their own rhythms with the ease of two people who had already built a foundation of trust before the domestic arrangement made it necessary. He showed her where the garden was, his mother's garden, with a seriousness that told her he was offering her something important, not a replacement, but an extension. She worked in it with him on the afternoons when the weather was fine, and she planted a row of sunflowers between the marigolds and the tomatoes, and Eli approved them with the considered manner of a senior gardener making a professional assessment. At night, when Eli was in bed and the ranch was quiet, and the Kansas sky performed its nightly extravagance of stars, Hazel and August sat by the fire, and he read, and she graded the papers she still brought home from the school, because she had kept her position, the school committee having been flexible on the point when August had spoken with them, and Hazel herself had made clear this was not a negotiable matter but a statement of who she was. And he had supported this with a completeness that made her love him a degree more that she had not thought possible. He began to sing again in the evenings, sometimes without apparent decision, just a phrase of something rising out of him while he read or set another log on the fire. He had a repertoire that ranged from hymns to old ballads to a peculiar, gentle lullaby he said his own mother had sung, and when Hazel asked him to sing the lullaby fully he sang it without self-consciousness, his eyes on the fire, his voice low and warm, and she sat very still and listened with her whole heart. "You have a beautiful voice," she told him when he finished. He looked at her with that slight surprise that compliment still produced in him. "Clara used to say that," he said. And then, as if he had surprised himself, "I'm glad you think so." She went to sit beside him and he put his arm around her and she rested against his shoulder and they watched the fire together, and the night was whole and complete around them. October brought with it the harvest and the last of the cattle drives and the particular melancholy and richness that comes with the deep season, and Hazel discovered, with a complex rush of feeling that she sat with for 2 days before she told anyone, that she was expecting a child. She told August on a Sunday morning, sitting at the kitchen table with their coffee, while outside Eli was engaged in an elaborate construction project involving the barn dogs and a piece of rope. She told him directly, looking at him, because she had found that with August the direct way was always the right way. He set down his cup. He looked at her. He looked at her for a long, thorough, totally unreadable moment, and then his face did what it rarely did entirely without control. It opened fully, like a window thrown wide on a summer morning, and what was inside it was so much joy that she felt tears at the corners of her own eyes. "Hazel," he said. "I know," she said. He stood up from the table and she stood up with him and he held her with his arms around her in the full way, not careful, not managed, just completely, his face against her hair, and she could feel him breathing slow and deep. "Are you happy?" she asked. "I don't have a word that fits," he said into her hair. She laughed. "Try." "Grateful," he said. "That is as close as I can get." She held him back, her arms around the solid reality of him, and felt the morning and the house and the wide Kansas world around them, and thought that grateful was, in fact, exactly right, because gratitude was what you felt when something was given to you that you had not known to ask for and needed more than you knew. Eli, when told, was tremendously interested in the logistical and scientific aspects of the situation, which he had apparently given some thought to, and produced a series of questions that Hazel answered with the measured accuracy of a schoolteacher, and August stood through with the expression of a man who is very glad to have a wife to handle certain things. When Eli had exhausted his initial curiosity, he said, with the gravity that he reserved for important pronouncements. "I will be an excellent older brother. I have been practicing with the Pierce children, and I believe I have the relevant skills." "I believe you do," said Hazel. "Good," said Eli. "Then it is settled." It was, she thought, very nearly the best conversation she had ever been part of. Winter came down over the Double B hard and white and cold, and they were ready for it. The cellar was stocked, the firewood was stacked higher than August was tall, and the cattle had been brought to the near pasture where supplemental feed could reach them. The ranch had a fortified quality that Hazel found deeply comforting, the sense of a place that had been built to last. She taught through the winter, riding or, in the worst weather, accepting a ride from August, who brought her in the wagon on the mornings he could and collected her in the afternoons. The children had come to regard Mr. Bailey the way children regard a figure of consistent, predictable goodwill, with affection and a degree of studied casualness that failed to conceal how much they liked him. He would sometimes come in to collect Hazel at the end of the day, and Eli would be already there, having stayed late to help her clean the slates. And August would stand in the doorway and have a conversation with whoever was still around with the ease of a man who has, without entirely planning it, become part of something wider than himself. In December, Caldwell held its Christmas gathering in the church hall, which was decorated with pine boughs and lit with every candle and lamp the town could produce, and the effect was lovely, warm and flickering and full. There was food and music and the children's choir, in which Eli sang with tremendous commitment to volume if not always pitch. At some point in the evening Reverend Crane brought out his fiddle and the dancing started, and August led Hazel onto the floor with the certainty of a man who has found his footing, and they danced together in the candlelight with her small round evidence of their coming child between them, and the fiddle played something slow and sweet, and his hand was warm at her back and his eyes were entirely on her. "I was just thinking," she said. "Tell me," he said. "Last December I had been here 3 months and I thought of you as the man from the general store who said much obliged and had sad eyes." He raised an eyebrow. "Sad eyes?" "They were," she said. "They're not now." He looked at her steadily. "No," he said, "they're not." They danced through another turn and the music was soft and the candles were lit and the whole of Caldwell was gathered in that room, and she thought about all the things that had to happen in the exact order they happened for her to be here in this place in this life, with this man's hand at her back and this music around them. "I'm glad I came west," she said. "So am I," he said. "Hazel, every day." In early spring of 1883, on a morning when the Kansas world was waking up from winter, and the first green was pushing through the cold brown of the pasture, Hazel Bailey gave birth to their son. It was a long labor that Doc Foote and Mabel Crane attended with competent steadiness, and August was in the house throughout, in that particular purgatory of husbands who would do anything if only there were something to do, and when Mabel finally came to the door of the bedroom and said, "You can come in," he went in with an expression of total controlled terror that broke the moment he saw Hazel in the bed, exhausted and entirely herself, holding a wrapped bundle. She held it out to him. He took it the way he took everything important, carefully, as if the thing had weight and value and deserved the full attention of both hands. He looked down at the face inside the wrappings, the small, extravagant face of a newborn, and he made a sound that was very low and very brief, and was the kind of sound that happens when something is entirely too large for the ordinary container of a person. "He has your eyes," Hazel said. "God help him," August said, which was not what she expected, and she laughed, which made the baby stir and blink, and Eli, who had been waiting in the hall with Pedro Vasquez and had been brought in by Mabel, came to stand beside his father and looked at the baby with an expression of tremendous assessment. "He's very small," Eli said. "You were small too," August said. "I was also very dignified," Eli said. "I have been told this by multiple sources." They named him Thomas James Bailey, Thomas for the Pierce boy who had been Hazel's first concern in Caldwell, James for August's father who had died when August was young, and whom he had spoken about to Hazel only once, but with a love that was clear in every careful word. Thomas James Bailey turned out to be a child of tremendous enthusiasm and strong opinion, qualities that appeared almost immediately and intensified over the following months. He was loud and warm and attached to every person in his field of vision, and laughed at things that were not, by any objective standard, funny, which made everyone around him laugh anyway. He was, in the assessment of the residents of Caldwell who saw him regularly, the image of his father in feature and his mother in spirit, which was considered a particularly fine combination. Eli took his senior brother responsibilities with the seriousness he brought to all things, and the sight of him reading to Thomas in the evenings, the baby propped against a cushion with the attentive look of someone who has not yet learned that words mean things but finds the sounds very interesting, was one that Hazel kept in the part of her that held the best things. The double B grew through that year, steadily, the way August did everything, with patience and intention and the refusal to rush what needed time. He brought on a second hand, a broad-shouldered man from Missouri named Cal Briggs, and with 3 men working the ranch could take on more cattle and improve the south pasture and begin, in August's quiet long-range planning, to talk about what the ranch might look like in 10 years. Hazel kept the school. She had fought for it gently but with complete determination, and the school committee, which had initially suggested she might want to resign upon the arrival of the baby, found that she did not want that at all and said so with a clarity that settled the matter. She arranged her teaching schedule around Thomas's needs, and Mabel Crane, who had developed a deep attachment to the Bailey family, took Thomas on the mornings when Hazel needed both hands free for the classroom and could not bring him. Thomas, for his part, regarded Mabel's house as a secondary kingdom over which he held substantial influence, and Mabel regarded him with the fond exasperation of a grandmother who has waited a long time for someone to spoil. Caldwell grew too, through 1883 and into '84, as the town shifted from a purely seasonal cattle economy towards something more settled. New families arrived, a new dry goods store opened, the bank expanded, and the railroad, which had been a rumor for 2 years, began to materialize in the form of survey teams and land discussions that filled the town meetings with both excitement and the specific anxiety of change. August attended these meetings and spoke twice, with his characteristic precision, about what the railroad would mean for the cattle market and what the town should require in terms of any land use agreements. And both times the room listened in the way it listened to a man who has thought about what he is going to say before he says it. Afterward, Hazel said to him, "You should run for the town council." He looked at her with his raised eyebrow. "I'm a rancher." "You're a rancher who thinks clearly and speaks carefully and has the respect of this town," she said. "Those are the requirements." He was quiet for a moment. "I'll think about it," he said. He thought about it, and 6 months later, when the council election came around, his name was on the ballot and he won, which surprised no one except possibly August himself. Diego Vasquez learned to read so well that by 1884 he was helping Hazel with the younger children on Saturday mornings, and had expressed, in his careful English that was growing daily more fluent, an interest in whether he might at some point teach himself. Hazel had encouraged this with everything she had, and had ordered books for him from a bookseller in Kansas City, and Diego's progress became one of the quiet, steady satisfactions of her teaching life, the kind that does not announce itself but compounds over time into something remarkable. Pedro Vasquez, watching his brother thrive, had his own private conversation with August one evening, and August came to Hazel afterward and said that Pedro wanted to save enough to buy his own parcel of land someday, and had asked for a slight increase in wages to put toward that goal. And August had said yes before finishing the sentence, and Hazel had looked at him with the particular expression she reserved for moments when he confirmed entirely why she loved him. The spring of 1884 arrived with everything spring arrives with on the plains, The wildflowers through the pasture grass, the smell of the earth turning, the cattle restless and moving with the renewed energy of the warming world. And Thomas Bailey, at just over 1 year old, had discovered walking, which he pursued with the single-minded intensity of a man with places to be, and pursued it specifically toward all the most inconvenient locations, which kept the entire Double B household in a state of alert affection. On a morning in April, which was a Saturday, which meant no school, Hazel woke early and lay for a moment in the half-dark of the bedroom before light was fully resolved, listening to the sounds of the ranch waking up. The dogs, the horses in the far corral, the particular early bird that had taken up residence in the elm tree August had planted along the east side of the house the previous autumn. She listened for August's breathing beside her and found only the warm impression where he had been, which told her he was up. She put on her robe and went through the house, and found the bedroom doors of both Eli and Thomas still closed, the soft sounds of sleeping children behind them, and went to the kitchen where the stove had been started and there was coffee, and she poured a cup and followed the morning out through the back door. She found August at the garden. He was crouched where Clara's marigolds were starting their spring return, the orange and yellow of them just beginning to push through the dark soil, the whole garden waking up from winter in the particular way of growing things, not all at once, but unmistakably. He had his coffee in one hand and was doing nothing with the other, just looking at the marigolds coming back. And he was singing. Not the same hymn as that first morning she had heard him, a year and more ago now, but something slower, something older, the lullaby that she now knew completely because she heard it every night when he put Thomas to sleep, his voice low and warm and moving through the morning air like something that belonged to it. She stood at the back door and listened with her coffee and the early light and the knowledge of everything this moment contained. The voice that had been silent for 2 years before she came, that had come back to itself gradually and then completely, that she heard now as naturally as she heard the elm tree's bird or the horses or the sound of her own name in his mouth. He sang. The garden listened. The morning expanded around them both, enormous and gentle, the Kansas sky beginning its daily climb from pale to gold to the full blue of the day. She did not interrupt it. She stood at the door and received it, all of it, and felt what she always felt in these moments. Not ownership, nothing like that, but membership. This life, this voice, this morning, this man, she was part of them and they were part of her, and it was the most settled and the most alive she had ever been. He finished the song and turned, perhaps sensing her there, and found her in the doorway. The look that crossed his face was the simplest look, just pleasure, just the specific gladness of a man who has turned and found the right person there. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," she said. He stood, brushing the garden soil from his hands, and came toward her, and she came down the back step to meet him, and he put his arm around her in the easy way of long intimacy, and she leaned against him, and they stood together at the edge of the garden with their coffee and the morning. "The marigolds are coming back," she said. "Every year," he said. "They always do." She thought about what that meant, the way things came back. Not the same, never exactly the same, but real and persistent and vital. She thought about the voice that had gone quiet and come back. She thought about the man who had closed his door against the world and opened it, slowly, one careful hinge at a time. She thought about Clara, whose garden she now tended with love and whose son she read to sleep with his father's lullabies, and she thought about what it meant to honor the thing that came before without being diminished by it, which was, she had learned, the particular art of loving a man who carried his history openly. "August," she said. He said, looking at the garden, "I want you to know that I am completely happy." He was quiet for a moment, and then he turned and looked at her with those rain-colored eyes that she had learned as thoroughly as any landscape, and what was in them was everything she could have wanted. Certainty and warmth and the specific depth of a love that had grown slowly and been built with intention and would not, she knew with her whole self, be moved by anything lesser than what had made it. "So am I," he said. "Hazel, so am I." From inside the house, there came the sound of Thomas James Bailey asserting himself in the firm pre-verbal way of very determined one-year-olds. And from the direction of Eli's room, the somewhat resigned sound of an older brother being woken. And August looked toward the house with a smile that was quick and real and full of life. And Hazel laughed. And they went in together to meet the morning, and whatever magnificent, ordinary thing it was going to become. The Double B was a place of raised voices and read books and late dinners and dogs underfoot, and two boys who were becoming, with every passing season, more themselves. Eli steady and serious and surprising, Thomas loud and joyful, and absolutely certain that the world was arranged specifically for his investigation of it. August sat on the council and worked the ranch, and came to the schoolhouse on Friday afternoons to pick up Hazel, and was, by the general assessment of Caldwell, Kansas, the most reliable man in the county, which was an assessment he would have dismissed if anyone said it to him directly, but which Hazel stored in the same collection where she kept everything true about him. She taught school for years, long past when anyone expected her to, past the birth of their second son in 1886, young James Henry, who had her amber-green eyes and August's set jaw, and who turned out to be the quietest Bailey and the most watchful, absorbing everything he saw with an attention that would one day make him either a lawyer or a storyteller, she thought, and was prepared to welcome either. She taught through the changes that came to Caldwell as the trail drives eventually slowed, and the railroad changed the shape of the cattle economy, and the town settled further into something that looked more permanent, something with a longer horizon. She adjusted her curriculum as the world changed, adding geography and new science and history told as fully and as honestly as she could tell it, which included the parts that the standard primers omitted, the full picture of who had lived on this land before any of them, what had happened to them, what it meant that this town sat where it did at the edge of a territory that had been reshaped by force. And she taught these things because she believed truth made people better and ignorance made them worse. And she kept teaching. Diego Vasquez became, by 1888, the assistant teacher at the Caldwell School, and when Hazel eventually reduced her own hours to 3 days a week in the early 1890s, he took over the other two with a capability that she celebrated loudly. Pedro Vasquez bought his land parcel in 1887, a fine piece of ground north of town, and August went with him to the land office and witnessed the signing with a handshake that said everything that did not need to be said. Eli Bailey, who had been a small serious boy reading his primer in the third row when Hazel arrived in Caldwell, grew into a young man of 18 who was beginning to talk about law, which Hazel had predicted, and August accepted with the complex pride of a father who wanted his son's life to be his own making. Eli went to Wichita to read law in 1887, and he wrote letters home that were, by any measure, exceptional, and Hazel wrote back to him letters that were longer because she had more to say and the time to say it. And the correspondence between them was the kind that both parties kept. Thomas, who was 5 when his brother left, accepted the new arrangement with the equanimity of a child who had always had the world's full attention and was prepared to distribute it further. He became, in Eli's absence, the primary daily excitement of the Double B, and the dogs adored him, and August took him out on the range as soon as he could sit a horse without falling off it, which was earlier than anyone expected. James Henry watched all of this from his characteristic position of attentive quiet, and said things occasionally that were so acute they stopped the room. They were, the Baileys of the Double B, exactly what they were, a family that had been assembled from grief and hope and two people's decision to believe that what they built together could be as real as what they had lost, and could contain both the past and the future without requiring either to be less than it was. On an October morning in the year 1890, August Bailey stood at the fence of the Double B and watched his cattle in the near pasture, and his son Thomas ride a circle around the yard on the small roan that had been the boy's 7th birthday gift. And he thought about the morning 15 years ago when he had stood at Clara's grave in the Caldwell cemetery in February, and could not find in himself a single note of any song. He thought about the years that had followed, the silence that had not been absence but had been a waiting, though he had not known it was a waiting until a woman from Ohio with amber-green eyes and a bold, plain way of saying true things had come riding into the Double B on a borrowed sorrel, and stood in his kitchen garden and looked at him, and said what she meant. He thought about the garden and the marigolds that came back every spring without fail, and about the morning she had heard him singing and known, before he had said the words, that something in him had come home to itself. He thought about the morning she had said yes, with wildflowers in her hand and the whole schoolroom full of May morning light. He heard her voice from inside the house, speaking to James Henry about something involving a book and a disagreement about when supper was, a conversation that involved much clarity from both sides, and he smiled into the October morning. He began to sing, a hymn, quiet and low into the cool air. The cattle moved. Thomas circled the yard and hollered something at the dogs. James Henry's voice from inside resolved into laughter. The song rose from him with the ease of something that has become native, something that belongs to the place it comes from and is not going to be taken away. And August Bailey stood at the fence of the life he had built and the life that had come to find him, and sang into the wide Kansas morning with everything he had. Hazel came to the back door, drawn by the sound the way she always was, and stood with her arms folded against the October chill and listened. And when she caught his eye across the yard, he did not stop, did not look away, did not manage the moment or contain it. He kept singing and held her look with the fullness of a man who has learned that the things worth having are worth the full weight of your attention, every morning without reservation. She smiled at him. He smiled at her. The song continued, warm and low, over the Double B and the October pasture, and the marigold garden going to sleep for the season, over the two boys who were his and hers and theirs, over the life they had made with patience and honesty, and the particular courage it takes to choose to love again when the world has already shown you what love costs. The Kansas sky went on above them, enormous and clear and full of light, as it always had and would, indifferent to the particular fates of any people beneath it. And the people beneath it made their lives anyway, built their gardens and their schools and their families and their love anyway. And the sky held them all, and the morning held them all, and it was enough, more than enough. It was everything.